solution. All right, quick biography. Also, I've learned a couple things, so you have to confirm whether everything is true. Professor of law at IE University, that I know is true. You work on competition law, commercial law, economic analysis of the law, I know this is true. And this is where, so your background includes a law degree from Oviedo, a LLM from Berkeley, okay, that one you never mentioned, and a PhD from Bologna. Interesting, so you speak Italian?
Yeah.
Oh wow. You had academic positions in a couple of Spanish universities, and you advised the European Commission, the World Bank, and the Asian development banks. We talked about empirical studies. You've done a lot of that in recent years, especially when it comes to private enforcement in competition law. So whether you talk about it or not is a surprise to me, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thibault. I'm going to try to be very brief. I'm not going to follow your questions, but the idea is first, I think law is not sexy. And I was saying, so we face a problem here, and I'm a legal scholar by training. And it's true that I don't know who was, I think it probably was Stiglitz. He said that law now, in order to be popular, needs to be law and something. I think one of the challenges we face there is that how are you going to do law and something if you don't know what the something is? And maybe you are not an expert in something. So for me, for example, if I say I will do law and game theory, I don't know shit about game theory. So anyway, how did I find my voice in competition law? Contrary to what Frederick said, the idea here is that I think there's not a master plan here or a path you follow. I think maybe there's destiny, but there's a lot of randomness. In my case, I did my PhD in securities regulation, and it was very, very boring. Yeah, and it was law, hard law, doctrinal and theoretical analysis. 600 pages of talking about the listing requirements. I put a chapter on what is the legal tool that companies use to list their shares in the US, which is called depository shares. And for me, the most challenging chapter was one that had nothing to do with law. There's a problem of arbitrage in prices of when you have shares that list in several markets. But by the way, Frederick said that this has to do with competition in the merits, at least in legal academia in Spain. It's all that, but that. It's the opposite. It's a disaster. It has to do with families in the legal sense. In some cases, even in some universities, if you don't have a certain family name, you will never progress. That's why I'm in a private university. I was never able to get a position in a state university. For many years, that was a problem, but now I'm happy that I didn't get that because, again, probably that's the situation in Spain. I think Italy may be similar, maybe France as well. Legal scholarship, but the boy is here, right? Why aren't you in Paris? Anyway, and then indeed, for many years I was doing traditional dogmatic legal scholarship that was very boring, and it's a paradox. I did my LLM, as Thibault said, in Berkeley, but at that time I was so blind that I didn't look at Bob Kutter or anyone there. Which, if you're looking from now, I say, you were so stupid. Like, you're there, and you're in the Cathedral of Economics, and I was taking classes with very relevant legal scholars. Again, legal scholarship in the US is different from Europe. I think it's much more interesting. I think we have, for example, in corporate law at that time, Melvin Ice and people there, very interesting, but I didn't go to the law and economics seminar. Many years later on, I went there. I started doing law and something else, and in particular competition law, because somehow, the thing that I find fascinating living in the Caribbean. This is just an intellectual thing that I think is, to make a living is nice, but competition law is live, talks about real problems. It's mainly economics, so the most relevant stuff here is said by economists. It used to be readable a few years ago. A few years ago, you could get the Journal of Economics and read it. Now try. It's impossible. It's very formalized. I don't know why economists do this, because then we don't read them anymore. Unless you are very smart, and I am not. Too many relations and stuff like that. And for the middle, I'm 55. So now I can see the things from perspective, and I cannot, because at the middle of my career, one of the problems I face is that looking back and looking forward, I said, what are your themes? Are you following a determined path? And at some stages I didn't. The problem is, and I picked a point there, I was a little bit of a dilettante. I picked this. When we had, we in AI now, we don't have a real library. Everything is virtual, which is terrible. But when we had the physical libraries, I used to like to hang around and find a book on law or something else and start reading. And at that time, when we used to make photocopies, when I came back from the US, I had to send several boxes of photocopies. I don't know, it could be, for example, the regulation, and it had to do more with psychology, I think, of advertising targeting children, and what kind of rules should you have. I was more interested in the psychological aspect than in the real rules. And by the way, a very interesting point here, looking back. Not only I didn't have a clear path, but I also have a folder now of started projects or articles which I never finished. And for many years I thought that I was failure. But it's part of the process, because sometimes you pick them back a few years later and you finish them. And having started 100 articles and only finishing 80 is not a problem. I think it's part of the process. And what happens when I advance a little bit in my career, several themes start to follow as the ones I work on. And for example, I found out at the end that all my publications, or my main publications, had to do with institutional framework of competition law enforcement, be it private or public. So I really didn't, of course I know the substance of the legal rules, but I was more interested in what kind of devices and tools different legal systems use for implementing competition rules. And it's very interesting because I never planned, and that's probably the last point I wanted to mention concerning the empirical projects that I am involved now. I remember when I started doing competition law 25 years ago, it was in a university with some students. At that time, computer power was not like now. Indeed, probably there was internet, but not as powerful as it is now. And we started to do a project with printed printouts of big Excel documents on the decisions by the Spanish Competition Authority, and trying to find out what were the criteria that the Competition Authority at the time used to set the amount of the fine. With time, it's very interesting now. The software I use almost every day is more Excel than Microsoft, which is amazing. I learned a lot of things, for example, from Orr Brook in the project we conducted looking at the judicial review of competition authority decisions in Europe. And also, by chance, once I published a blog post, I think we should all publish for young people. Don't forget about writing articles. I think no one reads articles anymore. If you write maybe 2-3 people, if it is more than 30 pages, no one is going to read that. I think and it has not to do with impact, which by the way, I don't know what it means, but the idea here is that people don't have time. And nowadays, with artificial intelligence as the topic of the next panel, my students do that all the time. They will ask one of these tools to make a summary for them, either a video or an audio. I think it's more interesting in Spain, the academic criteria are introducing blog posts as something that's a relevant academic output. But law is not science. Someone mentioned here law science. That's a joke. Law science. I don't even think economics is a science. Science are other things, right? That was my final point. I never thought about practicing law. Although my first year, once I came out from law school, I worked a year in Bryce, no? You were in Bryce?
Yeah.
I was there only a year before I went to Berkeley. So then I wanted to be an academic alone. But once I published something on private enforcement, and often call me, and that's the one I work 1 day per week with. I initially was very skeptical about this idea. I'm an academic. I teach, I write, I live, but work for a law firm, but they pay good money. What the interesting thing is that they provided me, apart from money, which is always a good thing, they gave me information and data that I would never have thought I would have access to from an academic perspective. All these kind of expert reports and other kinds of legal materials in Spain, for example, judgments according to the constitutions are public, but that's far from the truth. There's like a black market in having access to judgments. And then I started doing studies looking at trends and all that. And now, I think that anything which is purely doctrinal or theoretical, but that doesn't have any empirical background, completely useless. One of the problems this raises, and I think in France they have even addressed the issue from a legislative point of view, is that once you give an empirical portrait of what's going on, some people may like that. Because you show their, I don't know if this is in English speaking, you show their assets, what's going wrong. And I think that's what happens in France these days with judges. You cannot do empirical studies of French law because it's forbidden. I don't know if it's even a crime. In Spain you can do it, but then the problem is some people may be unhappy with what you say. And me, personally, I have assumed that my role as an academic is to do that. For example, the Decision Authority hates me because I keep telling how it's a shame that 60% of the fines are quashed in court. In many cases because they make mistakes in counting limitation periods, in counting, they notify the decision 3 days after the deadline. How can you do that? 2025. Do you need a calendar? So they don't like me. But I think academics, we need to do that. So we need to have a critical voice, and I think that's, apart from all the tools, I think the important thing here, and that's what I saw in some of the works that we presented for this competition. I think that's really valuable. In Spain, most of legal scholarship is purely descriptive. And some of the work we presented here for the competition was much better than I would have learned in Spanish academia for many years. And that's all that I wanted to say, but of course I'm happy to discuss anything else you may want.